A black employee worked twice as hard for half the recognition. But when his boss stole his idea, justice came in the most unexpected way. The air in the conference room was heavy with expectation. The long mahogany table gleamed under the bright overhead lights, its surface littered with notepads, pens, and coffee cups. The company's top executives, dressed in sharp suits and expensive watches, sat upright in their chairs, waiting. Some whispered among themselves, while others checked their phones, their expressions impatient. At the far end of the room, Darius Johnson clutched his notes, his fingers slightly damp. With nervous energy, his heart pounded beneath his crisp blue dress shirt. Months of sleepless nights, countless revisions, and meticulous research had led to this moment. He had crafted an idea that could change everything for the company. A strategy so innovative that he knew, without a doubt, it would take them to new heights. He exhaled slowly, grounding himself. This was his chance. CEO Richard Langston sat at the head of the table, perfectly poised in his tailored suit. His salt and pepper hair was combed back with precision, his expensive watch glinting under the fluorescent lights. He was a man who commanded attention without asking for it, a figure of authority that no one dared question. Darius watched as Langston tapped his fingers on the polished wood, surveying the room with an easy confidence. Then, just as Darius opened his mouth to speak, Langston cleared his throat. The sound silenced the room instantly. "We've been working on something exciting," Langston announced, his voice smooth, practiced. He leaned forward, a small smile playing on his lips. "A new strategy that will redefine how we approach the market." Darius froze. He recognized the words immediately. They were his. Every concept, every insight, every meticulously crafted detail, spoken effortlessly by Langston, as though they had been his own. The room stirred with interest. Executives nodded, some scribbling notes, others whispering in agreement. The CFO leaned forward, intrigued. A few members of the board exchanged impressed glances. Darius's stomach tightened. His fingers curled around the edges of his papers, his knuckles white. No, this wasn't happening. Langston continued, weaving effortlessly through the proposal as if he had conceived it himself. He spoke with authority, with certainty, embellishing the details with just enough confidence to make it seem as though they had come from his own mind. And then, applause. A wave of it. Darius sat in stunned silence as the room erupted in approval. "Brilliant," someone murmured. "A game changer," another executive whispered. Langston simply nodded, basking in the praise. He cast a glance at Darius, just a flicker of amusement in his eyes before turning away. Darius felt a slow, burning heat rise in his chest. He had worked tirelessly for this, sacrificed weekends, spent endless nights perfecting every calculation, every projection. And now, in a matter of minutes, it had been stolen right from under him. He wanted to speak up, to demand justice, but his throat felt dry, his mind racing with the weight of the moment. What could he say? If he interrupted now, would anyone even believe him? Langston had already won the room. Darius's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was a theft. One that had been executed in broad daylight, right in front of everyone, and no one had even noticed. Darius had always believed that hard work would eventually pay off. For years, he was the first to arrive at the office and the last to leave. While others took long lunches, he worked through his break. While colleagues chatted about their weekend plans, he stayed glued to his screen, refining strategies, running numbers, crafting ideas that could push the company forward. And yet, when it came time for promotions, for recognition, for a seat at the table, he was always overlooked. It wasn't that he wasn't talented. In fact, he knew he was one of the best. His ideas were solid, his work ethic unmatched, but somehow they always seemed to slip through his fingers. Whenever he proposed something innovative, the response was the same: polite nods, empty acknowledgments, and then silence. Weeks or months later, he'd hear someone else, usually a senior executive, presenting those same ideas as their own. At first, he thought it was coincidence. Then he thought maybe he just wasn't speaking loudly enough. So, he tried harder. He refined his pitches, made his presentations sharper. He stayed up late, making sure every detail was flawless. He even rehearsed in front of the mirror, practicing his delivery, making sure his voice was confident, assured. But the outcome never changed. No matter how much effort he poured into his work, someone else always reaped the rewards. At company meetings, his suggestions were brushed aside, only for someone else to present them later, wrapped in shinier packaging, with a different name attached. When it happened the first few times, he bit his tongue, telling himself to be patient. He was a team player. He wasn't here for credit. He was here to make an impact, but patience had limits. And today, sitting in that conference room, watching Langston deliver his presentation as if it were his brainchild, Darius felt something inside him snap. This wasn't just another stolen idea. This was the idea, the one he had spent months perfecting, the one that could finally prove his worth to the company, the one that could have changed his life, and Langston had taken it right from his hands. Darius stared at the CEO, at the way he effortlessly commanded the room, at the way the executives leaned in, captivated. He had been so careful, so meticulous. He had shared his research only with select team members, preparing to present it himself. And yet somehow, Langston had gotten his hands on it. Darius gritted his teeth, his nails digging into the pages of his notes. How long was he supposed to accept this? How many more times would he let someone else take credit for his work? He had learned to stay quiet, to swallow his frustration. But this time was different. This wasn't just another stolen idea. This was his chance, his breakthrough. And he wasn't going to let it go without a fight. Darius sat still, gripping his pen so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind was a storm of emotions, anger, betrayal, frustration. But more than anything, a single question echoed in his head. What do I do now? Calling Langston out in front of everyone was tempting. The words burned in his throat, ready to erupt. This is my work, my idea. You stole it. But what would that accomplish? Langston was the CEO. He had the power, the connections, the influence. If Darius spoke up, there was no guarantee anyone would listen. Worse, he could lose his job in an instant. And without proof, he'd just look like another bitter employee trying to take down the boss. No, a direct confrontation wouldn't work. He had to be smarter. His eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign that someone else had noticed what just happened. Then something unexpected. A few board members exchanged glances, subtle but telling. Darius caught the way their brows furrowed, the flicker of doubt in their eyes. It was as if they had seen this before, ideas appearing out of nowhere, conveniently credited to Langston. And then, one of them spoke. Evelyn Carter, a senior executive, with years of experience in the company, leaned forward, studying Langston carefully. Unlike the others, she didn't seem impressed. She seemed suspicious. "This is impressive," she said, her voice smooth but firm. "Mr. Langston, can you walk us through the development process?" The room fell silent. Langston hesitated. It was barely noticeable, a fraction of a second, but Darius caught it. For the first time since the meeting began, Langston didn't have a ready answer. Darius felt his heart pound. The CEO shifted in his chair, clearing his throat. "Of course," he said, regaining his composure. "This idea has been in the works for quite some time. My team and I have been refining the strategy, running data models, and making sure it aligns with our long-term vision." A practiced response, confident. But something about it felt off. Evelyn didn't look convinced. "And who exactly was involved in this refinement process?" she pressed. "I assume there's a paper trail. Notes, drafts, emails." Langston's jaw tensed ever so slightly. Darius exhaled slowly. She knows, or at the very least, she suspected. Langston let out a short chuckle, attempting to brush it off. "Well, you know how these things go," he said. "Ideas evolve through collaboration. It's a team effort, a non-answer, a way to avoid specifics. Darius clenched his fists under the table. He had spent months developing this proposal, alone. There was no collaboration. There was no team effort. Langston hadn't even been aware of the idea's existence until somehow he had gotten his hands on it. And now, for the first time, the cracks in Langston's confidence were starting to show. Darius felt something stir inside him. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't over. The tension in the room thickened like a brewing storm. Langston's smile, once confident, effortless, was beginning to crack. His responses were growing increasingly vague, his polished corporate charm failing under the weight of scrutiny. Evelyn. Carter didn't let up. "You mentioned refining the strategy," she said, flipping through a blank notepad as if expecting something to appear. "Surely there's documentation to support that. Emails, drafts, meetings?" Langston forced a chuckle. "Of course, I can have my assistant gather those." Evelyn arched a brow. "Gather them? So they aren't readily available?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Darius could see it now, the way the board members glanced at each other, their expressions shifting from interest to skepticism. Langston had built his career on confidence, but this wasn't a pitch he could bluff his way through. Because the truth was simple. He didn't know the details, and the board was starting to see it. Darius felt his pulse quicken. This was his chance. Slowly, deliberately, he cleared his throat. The sound cut through the silence. "If I may," he said, his voice steady, "I can elaborate on the details." All eyes turned to him. Langston shot him a look, sharp, warning, but Darius met it head on. No hesitation, no fear. Evelyn gestured toward him. "Go ahead." Darius inhaled deeply, and then he spoke. He walked them through every step, how he had identified the market gap, how he had run data models to prove profitability, how he had structured the rollout plan to minimize risk and maximize impact. His words were precise, measured. He didn't just present the idea, he owned it. As he spoke, the energy in the room shifted. The board members were no longer looking at Langston. Their eyes were on Darius, nodding, taking notes, engaged. For the first time, he wasn't just an employee sitting on the sidelines. He was the expert in the room. Langston sat rigid in his chair, hands clasped tightly in front of him. The smugness was gone. By the time Darius finished, the applause wasn't for Langston anymore, it was for him. Langston's collar suddenly felt too tight. His once polished demeanor had crumbled, and now, under the unrelenting stares of the board members, he was visibly sweating. He let out a forced chuckle, trying to mask his discomfort. "I, of course, had help in refining the concept," he said, his voice a shade too high, too eager to maintain control. "Darius and I worked closely on this. Collaboration is key in a company of this scale." Darius remained silent. He didn't need to say anything. The board members weren't fools. They had seen how Langston had fumbled through the explanation, how he had struggled to answer even the simplest of questions. And they had seen Darius, the way he had owned every detail, the way his expertise had effortlessly commanded the key. Evelyn Carter leaned forward, folding her hands on the table. Her voice was calm, but sharp as a knife. "Mr. Langston," she said, her gaze piercing, "it's clear who the real mind behind this strategy is, and I think it's time we acknowledge talent where it's due." The weight of her words settled. Over the room like a final verdict, a long silence stretched between them. Langston's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in his career, he had no defense, no quick talking his way out, no authority to lean on. One of the other board members cleared his throat. "I agree with Ms. Carter." Another nodded. "Darius, your work on this is impressive." Then the decision came. Darius wasn't just given credit. He was offered a leadership position, one that positioned him just beneath the CEO. Langston stiffened. His fingers curled into fists against the table. He knew what this meant. His authority was no longer unquestionable. His position, once untouchable, was now fragile. For years, he had built his success on the work of others, on taking credit where it wasn't due. But today, the tables had turned. Darius stepped out of the boardroom, his heart pounding. But this time it wasn't from frustration or disappointment. It was something else, something lighter. For the first time in his career, he wasn't walking away with his ideas stolen, his efforts ignored. This time the truth had won. A slow smile crept onto his face as he adjusted his tie, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The weight of years of dismissal, of being overlooked, of knowing he was the smartest man in the room but never being acknowledged for it, it was finally lifting. As he walked down the hallway, colleagues approached him, shaking his hand. "Congratulations. Darius, you deserve this. Man, I always knew you had it in you. About time someone recognized your work." He nodded, thanking each of them, his chest swelling with pride. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been in his shoes. Behind him, the boardroom door shut with a quiet finality. Inside, Langston sat motionless at the table, his face pale. His fingers tapped against the glossy surface, a nervous rhythm betraying his thoughts. For years, he had stood at the top, untouchable. But today he had been exposed, not by revenge, not by an outburst, but by something far more damning. His own arrogance. He had underestimated Darius. He had underestimated the board. And now, the very people he had impressed for years were looking at him differently. Not with admiration, not with respect, with doubt. Darius hadn't just proven his worth, he had proven something greater. That real success, real brilliance, real leadership couldn't be stolen. It had to be earned. Langston had spent years believing power meant never being questioned. That authority gave him the right to take what he wanted without consequence. But today, the truth had caught up with him. As he sat in the empty boardroom, staring at the polished table where his downfall had played out, he felt the weight of something he had never experienced before: accountability. No matter how many times he adjusted his tie, how many deep breaths he took, he couldn't shake the feeling in his gut. The uneasy realization that his days of unchecked control were numbered. Meanwhile, down the hall, Darius sat in his new office, a space that, just hours ago, had been off limits to him. His fingers traced the edges of a sleek nameplate on the desk. His name, his title. It had taken years of quiet endurance, years of watching his ideas be stolen, his efforts overlooked. And yet he had never taken shortcuts, never betrayed his integrity. In the end, he hadn't needed to humiliate Langston. He hadn't needed to fight dirty. He had won by being exactly who he always was, brilliant, prepared, and undeniable. And that was a victory no one could ever take from him.